He was tracking the black horse you stole. Jorth's hand fell limply to his side, and his face turned red with anger. He raised his hand as if to strike Ellen, but Daggs grabbed his wrist to stop him. Jorth struggled to free himself, cursing under his breath. "Let go, Daggs," he shouted. "Am I drunk that you're grabbing me?" "Well, you're not drunk, I reckon," Daggs replied sarcastically. "But there are some things I'll keep to myself." Jorth regained his composure, but it was clear that he was in shock. "Ellen, did Colin Van de Weyck see this black horse?" he asked. "Yes, he asked me how I got Spades, and I told him," Ellen replied. "Did he say Spades belonged to him?" "Sure, I reckon he proved it." "A horse that loves its master can always be told," said Jorth. "Did you offer to give Spades back?" he asked Ellen. "Yes, but Van de Weyck wouldn't take him," she replied. "Ha, why not?" Jorth asked. "He said he'd rather I kept him. He was about to engage in a dirty, blood-spilling deal, and he reckoned he wouldn't be able to care for a fine horse. I didn't want Spades. I tried to make Van de Weyck take him, but he rode off. And that's all there is to that," Ellen explained. "Maybe it's not," Jorth replied, chewing his mustache and giving Ellen a dark, intent gaze. "You've met this Van de Weyck twice." "It wasn't any fault of mine," Ellen retorted. "I hear he's sweet on you. How about that?" Ellen felt the blood rush to her neck, cheek, and temple, but she met her father's suspicious gaze with truthful, blazing eyes. "I hear talk from Bruce and Lorenzo," Jorth continued, "and Daggs here." "Daggs nothing," interrupted Daggs. "Don't bring me in. I said nothing, and I think nothing." "Yes, Colin Van de Weyck was sweet on me, Dad, but he will never be again," Ellen replied in a low tone. She then pulled her saddle off Spades and walked off to her cabin with it. Hardly had she gotten indoors when her father entered. "Ellen, I didn't know that horse belonged to Van de Weyck," he began in a swift, hoarse, persuasive voice. "I swear I didn't. I bought him, traded with Slater for him. Honest to God, I never had any idea he was stolen. When you said that horse you stole, I felt as if you'd knifed me." Ellen sat at the table and listened as her father paced back and forth, working himself into a frenzy with his restless actions and passionate speech. He talked non-stop, as if her silence was a condemnation of him, and as if his words alone could prove his honesty. It appeared that Ellen was more perceptive and aware than ever before. He yearned for her respect, not necessarily her love, as she could tell, but that she wouldn't see how he had failed. She felt sorry for him with all her heart. He was all she had, and she was all he had. As she listened to his long, illogical explanations and defenses, she gradually realized that her love and pity were making important decisions for her. As always, in poignant moments, her father eventually started denouncing the Van de Weys and what they had done to him. At least in Ellen's presence, his suffering was real. She was the only connection that linked him to happier times that had long passed. She was just like her mother, who had betrayed another man for him and followed him to her own ruin and death. "Dad, please don't go on like this," Ellen said, interrupting her father's rant. "I will be loyal to you as my mother was. I am a Jorth. Your place is my place, your fight is my fight. Don't ever talk about the past to me again. If God spares us from this feud, we will leave and start anew, far away where nobody knows about the Jorths. If we're not spared, at least we'll have had our chance against these damn Van de Weys." Chapter 7. In the month of June, Colin Van de Weyck decided to stick close to Pleasant Valley. This was due to yet another assassination attempt on Cito Van de Weyck's life. The perpetrator had taken the cowardly route of firing a shot from an ambush point, which happened to be a pine thicket situated along the trail leading to Blaydell's ranch. So close was the shot that Blaydell, who lived nearby, heard it loud and clear. Despite searching for the assailant, no trace of them was found. The area surrounding the site was covered in pine needles, and no footprints could be found. It was believed that the Jorths were behind the cowardly attack on Cito Van de Weyck, but there was no evidence. Van de Weyck had other enemies in the Tonto Basin, so it wasn't clear who was responsible. He was furious about the attack, and his friend Blaisdell suggested they gather their family and friends to arm themselves and take action. Blaisdell warned that waiting could result in someone being shot in the back. Others agreed, but Van de Weyck refused to act until they had concrete proof. Blaisdell argued that finding the black horse at the Jorths ranch was evidence enough, but Van de Weyck was not convinced. They were losing cattle regularly, and Blaisdell pointed out that someone had to be stealing them. Van de Weyck argued that cattle had been lost since they started ranching in the area. Blaisdell accused him of wanting the fight to start in the open, but Van de Weyck insisted that it would start soon enough. Colin had some success in tracking lost or stolen cattle, but the heavy rains had washed away tracks and made it difficult to follow them. The range was vast, and it was easy for cattle to get lost or stolen without being noticed for weeks. Van de Weyck's sons were now the only ones left to ride the range, as 2 riders had quit due to the conflict, and Van de Weyck had let another go. Colin often only learned of stolen cattle once their tracks were old. The Pleasant Valley countryside was riddled with horse and cattle tracks. Rustlers had been at the game for a while, but now that they had a reason to show their cunning, they did. As July rolled around, the hot weather hit hard. The red ridges of Tonto were a scorching desert where the days were unbearable, but the nights were cool and the mornings pleasant. Colin welcomed the white cumulus clouds that rolled up from the southwest, growing larger and darker until they coalesced into a black thundercloud. He loved seeing the gray streamers of rain hanging down from a canopy of black, and the roar of rain on the trees as it approached like a trampling army was always welcome. The grassy flats, red ridges, rocky slopes, thickets of manzanita, scrub oak, and cactus were all dusty, glaring, and throat-parching places under the hot summer sun. Colin yearned for the cool heights of the rim, the shady pines, the dark sweet verdure under the silver spruces, the tinkle and murmur of the clear rills. However, he also had another longing that he bitterly stifled. Colin's ally, the keen-nosed shepherd dog, had disappeared one day and never returned. Among the men at the ranch there was a difference of opinion as to what had happened to Shep. The old rancher thought he had been poisoned or shot. Mike and Slim Van de Weyck believed he had been stolen by sheep herders who were always stealing dogs. Colin, on the other hand, believed that Shep had gone off with the timber wolves. The fact was that Shep did not return, and Colin missed him. One morning at dawn, Colin heard the cattle bellowing and trampling out in the valley. Upon hurrying to a vantage point, he was amazed to see over 500 steers chasing a lone wolf. Colin had never seen anything like it before. A big gray and black wolf was trying to outmaneuver a group of steers. The wolf had probably been stalking the herd, hoping to catch a young calf, but the steers were too quick for him, and they charged him instead. Colin watched from the edge of the valley, hoping the wolf would come closer so he could take a shot with his rifle, but the wolf was too smart for that and eventually ran off. After breakfast, Colin set off across the valley to check on his father's sheep. They were being watched by 2 boys, young Evarts and a Mexican named Bernardino. Colin knew they were inexperienced and worried about their ability to protect the sheep from predators. As he rode up one of the hills, he heard a shot. It wasn't a rifle shot, which concerned him. Evarts and Bernardino only had rifles, not small arms. Colin surveyed the area and saw a group of horsemen riding towards the village in the distance. The number of horsemen was impossible for Colin to discern. The dark mass that moved in the distance seemed alive, mysterious, and menacing. Colin couldn't recognize horses, let alone riders, from that far away. They were moving too fast. Colin watched them disappear from sight and then headed back down the hill on his quest. It was an unusual sight to see a group of horsemen like that around Pleasant Valley at any time. Colin felt a new sensation of dread as he pondered what it could mean. He continued on his way until he arrived at the draw where the camp of the sheep herders was located. As he came into view of the camp, he heard a horse shout. Young Evarts came running frantically out of the brush. Colin urged his horse into a run and quickly covered the distance between them. Evarts appeared to be in a state of terror. "What's going on, boy?" Colin asked as he dismounted, rifle in hand. He quickly scanned the area from Evarts' white face to the camp and all around. "Bernardino! Bernardino!" gasped the boy, wringing his hands and pointing. Colin ran the remaining distance to the sheep camp. He saw the small teepee, a burned-out fire, a half-finished meal, and then the Mexican lad lying prone on the ground, dead, with a bullet hole in his ghastly face. Near him lay an old 6-shooter. "Whose gun is this?" demanded Colin as he picked it up. "Bernardino's," replied Evarts huskily. "He just got it the other day." "Did he shoot himself accidentally?" "Oh, no, he didn't do it at all." "Then who did?" "The men that rode up, they did it," panted Evarts. "Did you know who they were?" "No, I couldn't tell. I saw them coming and I was scared. Bernardino had gone for water. I ran and hid in the brush. I wanted to yell, but they came too close. Then I heard them talking. Bernardino came back. They appeared friendly-like. They forced me to sit up and look, but my vision was hazy. I heard one of them ask Bernardino to see his gun, and the boy handed it over. The man examined it and then tossed it up in the air, causing it to fire and hit Bernardino. I crouched down in fear, listening to their conversation but unable to make out the words. They eventually rode off, leaving me alone with the lifeless body of the young Mexican boy. Colin demanded to know if I had a horse, and when I said no, he instructed me to ride one of Bernardino's burros to Blaisdell to alert Blue, Gordon, and Fredericks to come to his father's ranch as quickly as possible. Colin was convinced that Daggs was responsible for the murder and that the Yorth-Vandewey War had officially begun. He covered the boy's body with a tarpaulin and rode off on his horse at breakneck speed, feeling a strange sense of relief that the waiting was over and the violence had finally begun. Colin knew that this was just the beginning of a long and bloody battle between the two factions, and he couldn't help but mutter to himself that his instincts had been right all along. That group of horses gave me a strange feeling, thought Colin as he rode swiftly through the grassy valley dotted with cattle. He scanned the area for any sign of the dark riders who had headed to Greaves's store to drink and add more enemies to their gang. Suddenly thoughts of Ellen Jorth and all the women, including his sister and the little ones, flooded Colin's mind. As he approached his father's farm, the peaceful and pastoral surroundings seemed to contradict Colin's dark thoughts. The grazing livestock, haystacks, fenced pastures, and cabins all exuded a sense of calm. Colin galloped up the lane and was greeted by Mike, Slim, and their father, who had come out to see what was going on. Without a word being spoken, they knew something was wrong. Colin quickly explained that Bernardino had been murdered with his own gun. Cito Vandewey, the father, let out a burst of air as his chest sagged. Mike asked what was going on, while Slim remained silent and turned slightly pale. A deadly glint grew in Cito's eyes, cold as sunlight on ice. "Damn," muttered Mike Vandewey, his voice rough and gravelly. None of the three men present bothered to ask who had committed the murder. They stood there, silent and still, lost in their own thoughts. Finally, they listened intently as Colin recounted the events. "Well, that puts us in a bit of a bind," said his father. "I should have listened to you boys and had my men close by. Jacobs just happened to ride over here. That means there are 5 of us, not counting the women." "Dad, you don't think they'll come after us, do you?" asked Slim Vandewey. "I always feared they might," replied the old man. "But I never thought they'd have the guts. I should have known better with Daggs involved. This secret business and shooting at us from ambush seems like something Yorth would do. But we'll have to fight without our friends." "Let them come," said Colin. "I sent for Blaisdell, Blue, Gordon, and Fredericks. Maybe they'll make it in time. But even if they don't, we can hold out here longer than Yorth's gang can stick around. We'll need plenty of water, wood, and meat in the house." "I'll take care of that," his father replied. "Colin, you go out and keep watch from a spot where you can see everything." "Who's going to tell the women?" asked Slim. The ensuing silence spoke volumes about the hardest and saddest aspect of this conflict between men. It was inevitable, yet utterly pointless. Men had been killing each other for as long as anyone could remember, and it was always the women who suffered the most. Old Cito Vandewey's lined face showed his understanding of this tragic truth. "I'll tell them," he said. "Don't worry about them, they'll be brave." Colin rode to a nearby knoll and stationed himself there to keep watch over all directions. The ridge behind the ranch was the only way Yorth's gang could approach undetected, but even so, Colin could spot them and ride to the house in time to prevent a surprise. Time seemed to drag on, and after an hour Colin hoped that Blaisdell would arrive soon, and he did. Colin heard the sound of hooves on the hard ground, and he saw Blaisdell riding his big white horse with a rifle in hand. Colin felt a sense of relief, knowing that Blaisdell was a true Texan who would stand by the Vandeweys no matter what. Colin watched as Blaisdell rode to the house and met with his lifelong friend. Suddenly, a moving dark patch appeared on the green of Pleasant Valley. It was a bunch of horses, and they were carrying riders. They were coming straight down the open valley on the wagon road to Vandewey's ranch. Colin's heart raced, and he felt a surge of adrenaline. "By heaven, they mean business," he muttered to himself. He had hoped that Yorth's gang would not come boldly like that, but the reality was undeniable. Colin knew that this was not conjecture nor probability, but fact. His instincts as a Texan left no doubts, no hopes, no illusions. He knew that Yorth's gang was coming, and they meant to do harm. Colin hurried back to the ranch, and his father saw him coming and strode out as before. "Dad Yorth is comin'," said Colin, his voice husky with emotion. The thought of having to tell his father pained Colin deeply. The love he had for his father as a boy resurfaced. "Where?" demanded the old man, scanning the horizon with his sharp eyes. "Down the road from Pleasant Valley. You can't see it from here," Colin responded. "Well, come on in and let's get ready," his father said. Vandewaya's house was not built with the intention of withstanding an attack from the Apache. The long living room of the main cabin was chosen for defense and protection. The room had 2 windows and a door facing the lane and a door at each end. One door led to the kitchen and the other to an adjoining cabin built later. The logs of the main cabin were large, and the doors and window coverings were heavy, providing better protection from bullets than the other cabins. As Colin entered the room, he felt as though he was being watched by a host of white faces. His sister Anne, his 2 sisters-in-law, and the children all looked at him silently with eyes that haunted him. "Well, Blaisdell, Colin says Jorth and his gang of rustlers are on their way here," announced the rancher. "Damn me if it's not a bad day for Lee Jorth," declared Blaisdell. "Clear off that table," ordered Vandeweghe, "and bring out all the guns and shells we have." Once laid out on the table, the guns and ammunition presented a formidable arsenal. The collection included 3 new .44 Winchesters that Colin had brought from the coast, the enormous buffalo or so-called needle gun that Sito Vandeweghe had used for years, a Henry rifle that Blaisdell had brought, and half a dozen 6-shooters. Piles and packages of ammunition cluttered the table. "Sort out these shells," said Vandeweghe. "Everyone should get their own." Jacobs, the neighbor who was present, was a thick-set, bearded man, rather jovial among those lean-jawed Texans. He carried an old patterned .44 rifle. "Well, boys, if I had known we were in for some fun, I would have brought more ammo. I only have 1 magazine full. Maybe those new .44s will fit my gun," said one of the men. Colin had brought a large quantity of ammunition that fit Jacob's rifle, which brought satisfaction to all the men present. "Well, we're lucky," declared Sito Vandeweghe. The women sat in a corner near the kitchen, watching the men with a strange fascination. Jacob's wife was a small woman with a plain face and bright eyes, and Colin thought she would be a helpful addition during the next few hours. Colin frequently looked out the window, peering down the road. His companions relied on him as no one else looked out. Despite the days and weeks of suspense, the Texans faced the issue with talk and actions that were not noticeably different from ordinary moments. Finally, Colin spotted a group of horsemen out on the valley road. They were close together, walking their horses and engaged in a serious conversation. After several attempts, Colin counted 11 horses, each with a rider. "Dad, look out!" Colin called out. Sito Vandeweghe walked to the door and stood silently. The other men crowded around the windows, while Blaisdell muttered curses under his breath. Jacobs exclaimed, "By golly, they've come to pay us a visit." The women sat motionless, their eyes dark and strained, while the children stopped playing and looked fearfully at their mother. When the horsemen were just out of rifle range from the cabins, they halted and formed a half-circle facing the ranch. Although Colin could see their gestures, he couldn't recognize any of their faces. It was odd that none of them wore masks. "Hey, Dad, do you know any of those guys?" Colin's father asked. "No, not yet. They're too far away," Colin replied. "I'll go get your old telescope," Slim Vandeweghe offered, running off to the next cabin. Blaisdell, a large man with a bull-like neck, shook his head and asked, "Well, now that you're here, you sheep farmers, what are you going to do about it?" Slim returned with a yard-long telescope and handed it to his father. The old man took it, his hands shaking as he looked through it. Suddenly he lowered the glass, shaking violently, and his face turned a bitter shade of gray. "Jorth!" he swore harshly. Colin could tell that his father recognized someone in the group and was deeply disturbed by it. He raised the telescope again and said, "Well, Blaisdell, there's our old Texas friend Daggs and Greaves, our honest storekeeper of Pleasant Valley. And there's Stonewall Jackson Jorth and Tad Jorth with the same old red nose, and damn if one of that gang isn't Queen, as bad a gunfighter as Texas ever bred. I thought he'd been killed in the Big Bend country, so I heard. And there's Craig, another respectable sheepman of Pleasant Valley. Ha! I don't recognize any more of them. Colin took the telescope and scanned the faces of the group. That's Sim Bruce, he said quickly. I see Jordan. And yes, Greaves is there. I've seen the man next to him face like a ham. That's Craig, his father interrupted. Colin recognized Lee Jorth by his resemblance to Ellen and felt a twinge. He thought he could also recognize the other Jorths. He asked his father to describe Daggs and then Queen. Colin knew he would not forget these men in the future. Blaisdell requested the telescope, and once he finished cursing, he passed it to others who eagerly took a peek. Eventually it landed in the hands of the old rancher. Well, Daggs is waving his hand over there like a general about to send out scouts. Ha ha. And it seems he's not overlooking our horses. Well, that's natural for a rustler. He'd have to steal a horse or a steer before going to a fight, dinner, or a funeral. It'll be his funeral if he goes fooling around those horses, declared Slim Vandaway, anxiously peering out of the door. Well, son, it'll be somebody's funeral, replied his father. Colin paid little attention to the conversation. He was fixated on the horsemen, trying to decipher their intentions. Daggs pointed towards the horses in the pasture lot between him and the house. These animals were the best on the range and mostly belonged to Slim Vandaway, the family's horse fancier and trader. His horses were his pride and joy. Looks like they're planning to steal some horses, said Colin. Lend me that glass, demanded Slim forcefully. He surveyed the men for a moment, then handed the telescope back to Colin. I'm going out there after my horses, he declared. No, exclaimed his father. That gang came to steal, not to fight. Can't you see that? If they wanted to fight, they would have done it. They're out there arguing about my horses. Slim picked up his rifle, looking determined and fearless. Son, I know Daggs, said his father. And I know Jorth. They've come to kill us. It'll be certain death for you to go out there. I'm going anyway. They can't steal my horses right in front of me, declared Slim. And they ain't in range, said Slim Vandaway, scanning the horizon. Well, Slim, you ain't going alone, chimed in Jacobs as he stepped forward. Slim's wife, a young woman with red hair, remained stoic. She had grown up in a tough world and knew how men acted in times like these. However, Jacob's wife pleaded with him, Mike, don't risk your life for a couple of horses. Jacobs laughed it off and replied, Not much of a risk, before heading out with Slim. Colin watched them go, feeling uneasy about their recklessness. He kept a watchful eye on them and saw the rustlers become aware of their presence in the pasture. He knew instantly that Daggs and Jorth had deadly intentions when they dismounted and readied their rifles. Dad, they're gonna shoot, Colin called out frantically. Yell for Slim and Jacobs to come back. The old man shouted, Mike Vandaway yelled, and Blaisdell's voice boomed. Colin screamed at the top of his lungs, Slim, run, run! But Slim and Jacobs continued walking towards the horses as if there were no danger around them. They were only a quarter of the way across the pasture when Colin saw the red flashes and white puffs of smoke erupt from the rustlers' rifles. The sound of gunfire echoed through the air, and Slim fell to the ground, dropping his gun as he clutched his chest. Jacobs stumbled and began to run, but his efforts were futile. He was hit, and his body convulsed as he tried to keep moving. Another shot rang out, and the sound of a bullet hitting its target echoed across the open field. Jacobs fell to his knees and then forward onto his face. Colin Vandaway felt himself freeze, the sudden tragedy paralyzing him. He couldn't take his eyes off the prostrate forms. A slim, hard, and tense hand clutched his arm, and a shaking woman whispered, Mike's killed. I was watching. They're both dead. The wives of Jacobs and Slim Vandaway had crept up behind Colin and witnessed the tragedy from behind him. I asked Mike not to go, faltered the Jacobs woman, covering her face with her hands before stumbling back to the corner of the cabin. The other women, shaking and white, received her in their arms. Slim Vandaway's wife, on the other hand, stood at the window, peering over Colin's shoulder. She had the nerve of a man and had seen death before. Yes, they're dead, she said bitterly. And how are we going to get their bodies? Cito Vandaway suddenly roused from the cold spell that had transfixed him. God, this is hell for our women, he cried out hoarsely. My son, murdered by the Jorths. Then he swore a terrible oath. Colin saw the remaining mounted rustlers dismount and begin to move to the left, leading their horses. "Dad, they're moving around," said Colin. "Up to some trick," declared Mike Vanderwege. "Mike, make a hole through the back wall, say about the 5th log up," ordered the father. "We've got to look out." The elder son picked up a tool and began to work at the designated point, scattering the children who had been playing nearby. The little ones backed away with fixed, wondering, grave eyes. The women moved their chairs and huddled together, waiting and listening. Colin watched the rustlers until they passed out of his sight, moving toward the sloping, brushy ground to the north and west of the cabins. "Give me a holler if they bust a hole in the back wall," Colin said before making his way through the kitchen and out another door. He slipped into a low-roofed shed at the end of the cabin where winter firewood was stored. The chinks in the walls were unfilled, allowing Colin to see out on 3 sides. He watched as the rustlers disappeared into the juniper brush. When they reappeared without their horses, Colin suspected they were planning to attack the cabins. They stopped at the edge of the brush for a long consultation. Colin could see them clearly, but he couldn't recognize any of the men. One of them broke away from the group and began to exhort the others. Colin thought it might be Daggs or Jorth, but he couldn't be sure. The man's loud, coarse voice and his actions made Colin suspect he was under the influence of alcohol. Mike Vanderwege whispered to Colin that he had made the hole, but they couldn't see anything. Colin replied that he could see the rustlers having a powwow. He informed them that either Jorth or Daggs was drunk and arguing to charge them. The rest of the gang was holding back. Colin instructed them to inform his father and keep watch while he waited for the rustlers to make a move. Jorth's gang appeared to be in no rush to expose their plan of attack. Some of them sat down while others walked around. 2 of them disappeared into the brush and returned with a pack. They deposited it on the ground, and all the rustlers sat down around it. They had brought food and drink. Colin couldn't help but let out a sardonic chuckle at the hash-knife gang's nonchalant demeanor. It brought to mind the countless reckless stunts that they were known for. He was relieved that they hadn't attacked yet. The longer they waited, the more time their allies would have to arrive. But it would be incredibly dangerous for anyone to try and reach the Vanderwege cabins during the day. Nighttime would be a more favorable option. Mike Vanderwege came into the kitchen twice to whisper to Colin. The tension in the large room where the rustlers were out of sight was palpable. Colin shared everything that he had seen and his thoughts on the matter with Mike. "Eatin' and drinkin'," exclaimed Mike. "Well, I'll be damned. That'll rile up the old man. He wants this fight to be over with." "Tell him that it'll be over too quickly for us unless we're extremely careful," retorted Colin sharply. Mike grumbled to himself before returning to the others. Then came the long and agonizing wait, during which Colin watched as the rustlers feasted. The day was hot and still, and the cabin's unnatural silence was occasionally broken by the merry laughter of the children. The sound was jarring and haunted Colin. Children playing during such a dire situation. Then he heard another noise, so faint that he had to strain to hear it, his father's slow footsteps pacing back and forth across the cabin floor. Colin couldn't even fathom what must be going through his father's mind at that moment. Finally, the rustlers stood up, rifles in hand, and advanced in unison down the slope. They moved closer until Colin, grimly cocking his rifle, muttered to himself that if they came just a few yards closer he could take out several of them. They knew the range of a rifle all too well, and so they veered off at a right angle away from the cabin once more. As they reached the line of corrals, they crouched down and disappeared from Colin's view, causing him to feel uneasy. It was clear that they were making their way towards the cabins. At the end of the corrals there was a ditch with a high bank that offered cover. The ditch ran in front of the cabins, only 100 yards away, and was covered in grass and small clumps of brush. This gave the rustlers the advantage of being able to shoot into the windows and through the clay chinks without putting themselves in danger. Colin knew their plan, even though he couldn't see them. He waited for a while until he saw small clouds of dust rising from behind the embankment. That was when he rushed to the large cabin, startling the men inside. "Get back out of sight," he ordered sharply, closing the door behind him. "They're behind the bank out there by the corrals, and they're going to crawl down the ditch closer to us. It looks bad. They'll have grass and brush to shoot from. We've got to be mighty careful how we peep out." His father replied, "All right, you women keep the kids with you in that corner, and you all better lay down flat." Blaisdell, Mike Vandaway, and the old man crouched at the large window, peering through cracks in the rough edges of the logs. Colin took his position beside the small window, his trained eyes scanning the area like a compass needle. He noticed even the slightest movement, like the blade of grass or the flight of a grasshopper. "Look sharp now," he called to the other men. "I see dust. They're working along almost to that bare spot on the bank. I saw the tip of a rifle, a black hat, and more dust." Yellow dust billowed up from behind the bank, accompanied by loud voices. Colin observed the scene, noting the reckless disregard for danger. Through the brush he caught sight of a figure with fair ruffled hair. It was Daggs, a tall man without a hat or coat. He called out to the Vandaways, daring them to come out and fight. Colin reacted quickly, raising his rifle and firing. He saw tufts of hair fly from Daggs's head and a squirt of red blood. His comrades also fired, hitting Daggs's swaying body. However, Colin knew with a terrible thrill that his bullet had killed Daggs before the others struck. Daggs fell forward, his body resting over the embankment. The rustlers dragged him back out of sight as hoarse shouts rose and the yellow dust drifted away. Sito Vandawege remarked that Colin had knocked off the top of Daggs's head, while Blaisdell commented that Arizona was bad for Texans. Vandaway sardonically added that rustlers had no practice at fighting, and that Daggs had forgotten this fact. Colin noted that Daggs had made a crazy move, like Slim and Jacobs before him. He cautioned his comrades to learn from this and not be overbold. Upon entering the cabin, Colin had smelled whiskey. Mike was a hard drinker, and his father was not immune. Blaisdell also drank heavily on occasion. Colin made a mental note to not let liquor ruin their chances. Rifles began to fire, and puffs of smoke rose along the embankment for about 100 feet. Bullets whistled through the window and hit the door, and one narrowly missed Colin. The rustlers had repeating rifles and were emptying their magazines. Colin moved, and the other men followed his lead. The volleys turned into one continuous rattling roar of rifle shots. Then suddenly the shooting stopped. The cabin was filled with dust and smoke. Colin heard the stifled breaths of the children, and the women didn't make a sound. A loud voice called from behind the embankment, but got no reply. Colin returned to his post by the window, and his comrades followed. They exercised extreme caution when they looked out. Sito Vandawege said, "Boys, don't shoot until you see one. Maybe they'll get careless, but Yorth will never show himself." The rustlers didn't use volleys again. They shot one by one from different angles. They weren't firing at random. Some bullets hit the walls, some hit the edges of the windows, and most hit low down. The rustlers had some unerring riflemen who were picking out the vulnerable places all along the front of the cabin. If Colin hadn't been lying flat, he would have been hit twice. He had a brilliant idea of driving pegs between the logs high up so he could kneel on them and see out of the window. It was awkward and challenging to hold, but allowed him to peek out from the upper edge of the window. During the attack, he heard a bullet hit one of his comrades, and Mike Vandaway was holding his shoulder, where red splotches appeared on his shirt. He shook his head at Colin, trying to make light of the wound. The women and children were lying face down and couldn't see what was happening. It was clear that Mike didn't want them to know. Blaisdell bound up the wound with a scarf, and the rustlers continued to fire, but the Vandaways didn't return the shots. Colin didn't fire again that afternoon. As the sun began to set, Blaisdell fired at something moving behind the brush, and Sito Vandaway's huge buffalo gun boomed out. They wondered what the rustlers would do after dark and what they could do themselves. Mike Vandaway was the gloomiest of them all, and there was something on his mind. Blaisdell didn't think the rustlers would charge them, but they might set fire to the cabins. They talked about the possibility of being burned alive, and Sito Vandawege expressed his fear of Lee Jorth, who he believed would skin him alive and throw red-hot coals on his raw flesh. Colin Vandawege had little to say and was busy thinking of possibilities. As darkness fell, the rustlers changed their attack strategy. They stationed men at 4 points around the cabins, and every few minutes one of these outposts would fire. The bullets had embedded themselves in the logs, but the Vandaways weren't too worried. "What do you think, Colin?" asked the old rancher. "Looks like they're preparing for a long fight," replied Colin. "They're shooting just to let us know they're watching us." "Uh-huh. Well, what are you going to do about it?" "I'm going out there soon," said Colin. Cito Vandewehe grunted in satisfaction. Inside the cabin it was pitch dark. The women had water and food, and Colin kept watch from his window while he ate his supper. Eventually the children fell asleep and the women whispered in their corner. Around 9 o'clock, Colin announced that he was going out to reconnoiter. "Dad, they've got the advantage in the daytime," he said, "but not at night." He strapped on a belt with shells, a bowie knife and revolver, and took his rifle in hand. He left through the kitchen to the yard. The night was darker than usual, with only a few stars visible through the clouds. Colin leaned against the log cabin and waited for his eyes to adjust. Like an Indian, Colin could see well in the dark. He knew every point around the ranch, every post, log, tree, and rock. After watching for about 15 minutes, during which several shots were fired from behind the embankment and one from the rustlers, Colin slipped out on his quest. He stayed in the shadows of the cabin walls, then the orchard trees, then a row of currant bushes. Finally, he crouched low at the edge of the open ground, looking and listening. He could see the dark patches of cedar and juniper trees on the gently rising slope before him. A streak of fire lit up the darkness on the north side of the cabin, followed by the sound of a gunshot and the impact of the bullet hitting the cabin. The ranch was silent and lonely, with a black blanket of darkness covering everything. The air was filled with a low hum of insects, and dull sheets of lightning illuminated the horizon to the south. Colin heard voices, but couldn't determine where they were coming from. Another rifle shot came from the west, and the bullet narrowly missed Colin before hitting the cabin. Colin surveyed his surroundings carefully, studying the dark, obscure area in front of him and the background behind him. He knew that as long as he stayed in the shadows, he couldn't be seen. He moved silently and with great care, making his way to the first clump of junipers. There he waited patiently for the rustlers to fire again. When the second shot came from the west, Colin moved to the right, taking advantage of the patches of brush, junipers, and cedars to make his way around to the rustler who was firing from that side. Colin climbed to the top of the ridge, descended the opposite slope, and turned left, using his perfect sense of direction to locate the rustler he was after. He saw the first flash of fire from this side and knew he had found his man. His plan was to silently kill the rustler with a knife and then move on to the next one. Colin laid aside his rifle and crawled forward on hands and knees, moving as quietly as a cat. His intention was to get as close to the rustler as possible before making his move. Moving with caution, Colin picked his way through the brush, careful not to make any noise that might give him away. His buckskin clothing made no sound as he approached the rustler sitting atop the ridge in the middle of an open space. The rustler was alone, smoking a cigarette with a dull red end. Colin realized that the rocky ground on the ridgetop would not allow him to crawl up on the rustler. He turned back, slowly retracing his steps to get his rifle. Once he had it, he returned to the edge of the open ridgetop, making sure to remain quiet. From his position, Colin could see the dark form of the rustler silhouetted against the sky. He carefully lifted his rifle, trying to avoid the twigs of a juniper, but suddenly he felt an unexpected emotion. What if this man was Ellen Jorth's father? Colin lowered his rifle, feeling it shake over his knee. He was trembling all over. The realization that he could not bring himself to kill Ellen's father awakened him to the despairing nature of his love for her. In this moment of indecision, Colin fully realized his strange, hopeless, and irresistible love for the girl. He made no attempt to deny it any longer. Like the night and the wilderness around him and the inevitability of the Jorth-Vandewehe feud, Colin's love for Ellen was a fact, a reality. To his inner self, Colin couldn't bring himself to kill Ellen Jorth's father. Regardless of the feud with Vandewehe, he knew he couldn't do it intentionally. But why? He couldn't answer that. Wasn't he disloyal to his own father? He had no chance of winning Ellen Jorth's affection, nor did he want it. Yet his love for her was undeniable, and he had to fight against the dangerous and inexplicable growth of that feeling. The passion had already made him a coward. His thoughts were consumed by Ellen Jorth, her beauty, her boldness, her pathos, her shame, and her debasement. But her sweetness overpowered her boldness, and the mystery of her existence protested against her acknowledged shame. Colin looked up to the infinite blue sky and the white, merciless stars, realizing he was just a tiny atom in the vast universe of nature. Compared to the immense and infinite something he sensed in that moment, what were he, his revengeful father, and all the hate and strife in the world? But the rustlers, Dags, the Jorths, they had killed his beloved brother Slim brutally and mercilessly. Slim had been Colin's favorite brother, and Mike had been secretive and selfish. Colin had never loved him as much as he loved Slim. Slim was lying dead down there in the meadow, and this feud was about to escalate into a bloodbath. Colin steeled his nerves. The hot blood started coursing through his veins, and the dark, powerful wave of revenge swept over him. His mind sharpened, and he knew he had to kill whenever and wherever he could. But he couldn't imagine that this man was Ellen Yorth's father. Jorth would be directing the hostilities from the main crowd. Colin had a plan. He was going to shoot the rustler guard and make it look like his own gang member did it. With his rifle in hand, he took aim and fired. He didn't even look to see if he hit his target. Instead, he felt a rush of emotions flood through him. His heart felt heavy and his body was covered in sweat. He had always known he had a gift for shooting, but using it for this purpose made him feel sick. Despite his reservations, Colin knew he had to keep going. He was fueled by the Van de Weyck blood that ran through his veins. As he made his way back to the orchard, he felt a sense of clarity wash over him. He knew what he had to do, and he was ready to do it. Colin crawled through the grass, moving slowly and cautiously towards the rustlers. He aimed to go around the end of the embankment behind which the rustlers were hiding. However, he miscalculated and ended up on the wrong side of the embankment. He listened carefully and soon heard voices. Then a shot rang out from the north side of the cabins. Colin remained still, waiting and listening. He knew that he had to be patient and act quickly when the opportunity presented itself. In the next 15 minutes, Colin discovered that the nearest guard was firing shots from the top of an embankment about 100 yards away, and another guard was doing the same from a spot just a few yards further. 2 rustlers in close proximity. Colin hadn't anticipated that. He pondered for a while on the best course of action and finally decided to crawl around and get behind them as close as possible without getting caught. He found a ditch behind the embankment, which was a favorable path to stalk these enemies. It was dry and sandy with borders of tall weeds. The only drawback was the dry, invisible branches of the weeds, which made it almost impossible for him to avoid brushing against them. To counter this, he moved like a snail, inch by inch, taking a long time before he caught sight of a sitting figure of a man, black against the dark blue sky. This rustler had fired his rifle 3 times during Colin's slow approach. Colin watched and listened for a few moments, then wormed himself closer and closer, until the man was within 20 steps of him. Colin smelled tobacco smoke, but could see no light of a pipe or cigarette since the fellow's back was turned. "Say, Ben," said this man to his companion, sitting hunched up a few yards distant, "it sure seems strange that Summers isn't shooting any over there." Colin recognized the dry, drawling voice of Greaves, which shocked him and seemed to contract the muscles of his whole thrilling body like that of a panther about to spring. Chapter 8. "I was thinking the same thing," replied the other man. "And hey, didn't that last shot sound too sharp for Summers's .45? "Now that you mention it, I think it did," responded Greaves. "Well, I'll go over there and check it out." The shadowy figure of the rustler disappeared over the embankment. "You better be cautious and move slowly," cautioned Greaves. "Get close enough to call Summers," whispered Colin. "That damn half-breed Van de Weyck might be coming with some Indians to attack us." The sound of footsteps through wet grass made Colin lie flat on his stomach. He looked ahead and saw Greaves' dark figure on the bank. Colin wanted to kill Greaves, but he resisted the strong urge to do so. If he shot Greaves, it would ruin his plan of slipping past the other outposts who were firing at the cabins. Colin wished to call out softly to Greaves, "You're right about the half-breed." Then he would kill him as he turned around. However, Colin chose to take a risk and leap upon the man. He did not bother to understand the strange, deadly instinct that had taken hold of him. He knew he had chosen the most dangerous plan to get rid of Greaves. Colin drew a deep breath and held it. He let go of his rifle and rose silently as a shadow. He drew his bowie knife and glided up the bank with light, swift bounds. Greaves must have heard the rustling and soft pad of Colin's moccasins, for he turned around with a start. Colin's left arm darted like a striking snake around Greaves's neck and closed tight and hard. With his right hand free, holding the knife, Colin could have ended the deadly business in just one move. However, when his bared arm felt the hot, bulging neck, something terrible burst out of him. Killing this enemy of his father's was not enough. Physical contact had unleashed the savage soul of the Indian. As Colin pulled back on the struggling body with all his might, he couldn't help feeling that familiar rush of adrenaline, the same dark pleasure he had felt when he had pounded Sim Bruce's face in. Greaves had sneered at him and confirmed Bruce's disgusting accusation about Ellen Jorth. It wasn't just anger that drove Colin to act, it was more than that. Greaves was a big, strong man who flipped himself over backwards, like a steer caught in a lasso. But Colin's grip held firm, and they tumbled down the bank into a sandy ditch. Colin landed on top, perpendicular to Greaves. "Your hunch was right, Greaves," Colin hissed. "It's the half-breed, and I'm going to carve you up for Ellen Jorth and Sito Vandawegi." Colin glared into Greaves's shining eyes. Then in a swift motion he drew his large blade and brought it down low into Greaves's body. The weighty frame of Greaves convulsed and shuddered with pain and terror, causing him to break free from Colin's grasp. Greaves let out a guttural scream that grew louder and more hideous by the second. He struggled to free himself, and as he did, the knife slipped from his body. Greaves managed to get to his knees, pulling out his gun as he did so. Colin lunged at him once again like a grizzly bear pouncing on its prey. Greaves fired his gun, but he couldn't lift it high enough or turn it far enough to hit Colin. Colin released his grip with his right hand and swung his bowie knife. Greaves's strength left him as he let out a hoarse cry. He fired his gun one more time before it dropped from his hands. He swayed and then collapsed lifeless into the ditch. Colin searched for his rifle and saw it glinting in the moonlight. He picked it up and sprinted towards the cabins. Shouts from the Jorth faction could be heard all around, demonstrating their excitement and fury. Colin saw a fence looming up ahead, gray in the obscurity. Without hesitation, he vaulted over it and darted across the lane into the shadows of the corral, soon reaching the first cabin. Leaning against the cabin, he tried to catch his breath. His heart was pounding so hard that it felt too large for his chest. His body was drenched in sweat, and the hot blood was surging all over him. His teeth were tightly clenched, and he had to make an effort to open his mouth to breathe more freely and deeply. But the physical sensations were nothing compared to the turmoil in his mind. Finally, the instinct released its grip, and Colin could think clearly. He had avenged Slim, depleted the Jorth's ranks, and proven his father's brag. All of these thoughts gave him satisfaction. However, they were not accountable for the bittersweet sting he felt. The fact that Ellen Jorth's defiler was now dead couldn't erase the doubt and regret that seemed to grow with every passing hour. Colin groped his way into the woodshed and entered the kitchen. He called out softly and went into the main cabin. "Colin! Colin!" His father's voice shook as he spoke. "Yes, I'm back," replied Colin. "Are you all right?" "Yes, I think I've got a bullet crease on my leg. I didn't know I had it till now. It's bleeding a little, but it's nothing." Colin heard soft steps, and someone reached out with shaking hands. It was his sister Anne. She embraced him tightly, and Colin felt the heave and throb of her breast. "Why, Anne, I'm not hurt," he said, holding her close. "Now you lie down and try to sleep." In the black darkness of the cabin, Colin led Anne back to the corner. His heart was full of emotions that he couldn't express. Speaking was difficult, as the mere touch of Anne's hands had made him realize that the success of his mission did not change the women's situation. "So what happened out there?" Blaisdell asked. "I got two of them," Colin replied. "The guy who was shooting from the ridge to the west and Greaves." "Ha!" exclaimed his father. "So it was Greaves yelling," confirmed Blaisdell. "By God, I've never heard such screams. What did you do, Colin?" "I knifed him. You see, I had planned to sneak up on them one by one, and I didn't want to make any noise. But I only got as far as Greaves." "Well, I guess that'll put an end to their shooting in the dark," muttered Sito Vandawegi. "We have to be on the lookout for something else, most likely fire." The old rancher's prediction was partly accurate. Jorth's group stopped shooting, and nothing else was heard or seen from them. However, this silence and apparent ceasefire were harder to bear than direct hostility. The long, dark hours passed by slowly. The men took turns watching and resting, but none of them slept. Finally, the darkness faded away, and the gray dawn emerged from the east. The sky turned rose over the distant range, and daylight arrived. The hungry and noisy children woke up, having slept away their fears. The women took advantage of the peaceful morning to prepare a hot breakfast. "Maybe they've left," suggested Slim Vandewey's wife, looking out of the window. She had done this multiple times since daybreak. Colin saw her somber gaze scan the pasture until it reached the dark, lifeless shape of her deceased husband, lying face down in the grass. Her expression worried Colin. "No, Esther, they haven't left yet," Colin replied. "I've seen some of them out there at the edge of the brush." Blaisdell was optimistic. He believed that Colin's nocturnal actions would have an impact and that the Yorth group would not resume the siege too aggressively. Blaisdell had been wrong. As soon as the sun rose, the Yorth gang began firing volleys from all directions, now closer than before. They had built earth banks and log breastworks overnight, hiding behind them while firing. Colin and his comrades returned fire as they saw flashes of fire and smoke. After half an hour, the cabin was filled with so much smoke that Colin could not see the womenfolk in their corner. The attack slowed down, and the firing became more intermittent and carefully aimed. A bullet grazed Blaisdell's head, causing a painful but not serious wound. Esther Vandeweghe skillfully stopped the bleeding and bound Blaisdell's head. Blaisdell was agitated and wanted to go out and kill them all. Sito Vandeweghe refused and insisted on staying put. The shooting continued without a break until midday, when the Yorth faction stopped. Esther Vandeweghe went to the window and suddenly started violently with a trembling hand outstretched. Blaisdell muttered, "What the hell?" Esther stood frozen, her eyes locked onto something in the distance. "What is it?" asked Colin, but she didn't answer. Finally she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Look, the hogs have broken into the pasture. They'll eat Slim's body." The group was paralyzed with horror as they looked out the window. A herd of large black hogs were rooting around in the grass near the bodies of Slim Vandeweghe and Jacobs. These hogs belonged to the rancher and were allowed to roam free. Esther turned to Jacob's wife, Jane. "Do you know anything about hogs?" she asked urgently. Jane ran to the window and froze, just like Esther had. "Dad, will those hogs eat human flesh?" Colin asked, his voice shaking. The old man looked out the window in shock. "Colin, can you shoot that far?" he asked. Colin shook his head. "No, it's out of range." "We've got to stay trapped in here and watch an awful sight," the old man said, his voice trembling. "Yorth's done that, to let in the hogs," Blaisdell tried to reassure them. "Yorth wouldn't do such a hell-bent trick," he said, but Vandeweghe knew better. "It's sure done," he said. As they watched in horror, the hogs began to move closer to the bodies. "Maybe the hogs won't find Slim and Jacobs," Blaisdell said weakly, but he didn't sound convinced. "Look," Esther cried out, "they're working straight up the pasture." To Colin it looked like the hogs were heading straight for the bodies. Anne Vandeweghe came to the window and cried out. Jacob's wife just stood there, stunned. "We can't stand here and watch them hogs eat our people," Blaisdell yelled. But Vandeweghe knew they had no choice. "What the hell are we supposed to do now?" Esther turned to the group of men, her face pale and her eyes blazing with anger. "Someone needs to go out there and bury our dead men," she said firmly. "But it's suicide," one of the men replied. "You saw what happened to Slim and Jacobs. We just have to accept it and move on." Colin wondered if it was possible to look away from the scene. The large hogs were rooting and tearing at the grass, some lazy, some nimble, and all getting closer to the bodies. The leader, a gaunt and huge boar, was only 50 feet away from Slim Vandeweghe's body. "Anne, get me some clothes and a sunbonnet, quick," Colin said, suddenly snapped out of his lethargy. "I'll go out there disguised. Maybe I can do it." "No!" his father thundered, his face dark with anger. "Slim and Jacobs are dead. We can't help them now." "But, Dad," Colin pleaded, his emotions high from Esther's passion and the agony in the face of the other woman. "I said no!" Sito Vandeweghe shouted, throwing his arms wide. "I will go!" Esther's voice rang out. "You won't go alone!" "You stay here," Sito Vandeweghe hoarsely replied. "I'm going," Esther replied, determined. "You have no hold over me. My husband is dead. No one can stop me. I'm going out there to drive those hogs away and bury him." "Esther, for God's sake, listen," Vandeweghe pleaded. "If you show yourself outside, Yorth and his gang will kill you." "They may be mean, but no white men could be that low," Esther replied, dismissing Vandeweghe's warning. They all begged her to give up her plan, but Esther was resolute. But their efforts were in vain, as the Yorths had murdered Slim Vandeweghe and Jacobs. The women had no choice but to bury their loved ones themselves. Colin, who had been present, feared for their safety as he watched them run out of the cabin and into the lane. His heart raced as he listened for the sound of gunshots, but was relieved to hear only the laughter of the Yorths outside. Maybe they weren't as bad as his father had made them out to be. The two women hurried to an open shed and emerged with a shovel and spade. Sito van de Wege urged them to hurry, as the leader of the hogs had likely scented the bodies and was approaching. Colin yelled for Esther to run as the hog approached Slim's body, but his shots did not reach or frighten the beast. All the hogs had caught a scent and were heading towards their leader. Esther and her companion disappeared from sight behind a corral, and their screams echoed through the air. The hogs appeared frightened, and the leader turned away, causing the others to follow. All was silent in the cabin and outside where the Yorth faction was hiding. All eyes were fixed on the brave wives as they spaded up the sod and dug a grave for Slim van de Wege. Esther wrapped him in her shawl, and they buried him. They then hurried to Jacobs, who was a heavy man, and dug a grave for him too. Mrs. Jacobs used her outer skirt to wrap him, and the women labored hard to lower him into the ground. As the women knelt beside their loved ones' graves, Colin watched from a distance, filled with a sense of helplessness. He knew that justice needed to be served, but he also knew that it wouldn't be easy. The woman stood stoically, not appearing to pray. Her demeanor was tragic, that of a woman who had lost her entire family to the bloody land of Arizona, including her husband. The actions and attitude of the wives of the murdered men must have brought shame to Yorth and his followers. They remained silent and did not fire a single shot during the ordeal. Inside the cabin, everyone was still and quiet, overcome with grief and shock. Colin wiped his eyes, which had become blurred with tears. Old Van de Wege openly wept, while Blaisdell nodded his head in agreement and swallowed hard. The women sat motionless, staring blankly ahead as the children watched in dismay. "Looks like they're coming back," Van de Wege declared with immense relief. "And by Yorth, they better let them bury their dead." The fact seemed monstrously strange to Sito van de Wege. When the women entered, he spoke brokenly. "I'm glad, and I reckon I was wrong to oppose you, and wrong to say what I did about Yorth." Before anyone could reply, the Yorth gang renewed their attack with a persistent and furious volleying of bullets. The defenders had to lie flat next to the lowest log to avoid being hit. Bullets rained into the cabin through the window, and the clay between the logs low down was shot away. The fusillade lasted for over an hour until the fire gradually diminished on one side, then the other, until it became sporadic and finally ceased. "Looks like they've shot their bolt," declared Sito van de Wege. "Well, I don't know about that," returned Blaisdell, "but they've shot a hell of a lot of shells." "Listen," suddenly called Colin. "Somebody's yelling." "Hey, Van de Wege," came a loud, hoarse voice. "Let your women fight for you," the derisive voice from outside taunted. Sito van de Wege's face turned livid, and he sat up with a start. Colin knew immediately that it was Yorth who had spoken. The old rancher lunged up, daring Yorth to meet him man to man, but there was no answer. Colin had to drag his father away from the window to quell his rage. A tense silence followed, but eventually Colin discovered that the Yorth gang had lifted the siege. They had congregated at the edge of the brush, and a team of mules appeared, drawing a wagon that was used to haul away the bodies of dead men. 7 mounted men, leading 4 riderless horses, rode out into the valley and followed the wagon. "We had the best of this fight," Colin declared to his father. "If only Slim and Jacobs had listened." Sito van de Wege sat down to wait for the members of his clan to return. The male members kept guard in turn over the ranch that night. But the ordinary routine of ranch life did not return for the Van de Weges. Blaisdell left to settle matters at home so he could devote all his time to the feud. And Sito van de Wege, who had aged considerably during these 2 trying days, showed a subtle change, a fixed and morbid sadness, a resignation to a fate he had accepted. As the sun rose on another day, news arrived from Blaisdell that Blue, Fredericks, Gordon, and Colmore were all at his house on their way to join the Van de Weges. Sito van de Wege was overjoyed at the news, but his excitement was short-lived. He became impatient and moody, pacing or sulking around the cabin, always looking out towards Blaisdell's ranch or Pleasant Valley. Colin noticed that Esther van de Wege and Mrs. Jacobs had not suggested a reburial of their husbands, which he found strange. The 2 women did not ask for help, but instead repaired to the pasture, where they spent several hours working over the graves. They raised mounds, sodded the area, and placed stones at the heads and feet. Lastly, they fenced in the graves. "I reckon I'll hitch up and drive back home," said Mrs. Jacobs when she returned to the cabin. "I've got much to do and plan. I'll probably go to my mother's home. She's old and will be glad to have me." "If I had any place to go, I'd sure go," declared Esther Vandeweghe bitterly. Cito Vandeweghe heard this remark and raised his face from his hands, hurt and nettled. "Esther, that's not kind," he said. Esther halted before his chair and gazed down at him with a terrible flare of scorn in her gray eyes. "Cito Vandeweghe, all I've got to say to you is this," she retorted with the voice of a man. "Seeing that you and Lee Jorth hate each other, why couldn't you act like men? You damned Texans with your bloody feuds, dragging in every relation, every friend to murder each other. That's not the way of Arizona men. We've all got to suffer, and we women will be ruined for life because you had differences with Jorth. If you had any guts, you'd go out there and take care of this yourself. Don't leave behind a bunch of widows and orphans." The words stung Colin, but he couldn't argue with the truth in them. Cito Vandeweghe, on the other hand, was left speechless and ashamed. He hung his head low, looking like a tragic figure. He didn't move until the sound of approaching horsemen caught his attention. Bladel arrived first, followed by a group of heavily armed men with packs. "Come on in," Vandeweghe said. "Mike, you take care of their packs. Keep the horses saddled." The group of riders came inside, their demeanor fitting their purpose. Colin knew all of them. There was Fredericks, a lanky Texan with yellow hawk-like eyes, and Gordon, who looked more like a miner than a cattleman. Blue was the most striking of the bunch, with years of cowboy experience etched on his face. He was quiet, cool, and deadly, with a shady past that nobody dared mention. He was the only one without a rifle, but he carried 2 guns, a habit not often seen in Texans or Arizonians. Anne Vandeweghe's fiancé, Colmore, was the youngest of the group and the closest to Colin. Seeing Anne's love for him made Colin realize something he had been considering for a while. They were young and their love was strong. Colin couldn't help but feel sorry for them. They had their whole lives ahead of them, and it seemed like a shame that Colmore was getting involved in this war. Colin watched as they talked amongst themselves, and he noticed Anne's hands slowly creep up to Colmore's chest. Her eyes were dark and full of questions, but her lips remained silent. Colin stepped closer to them and draped his arm over their shoulders. "Colmore, for Anne's sake, you should really consider backing out of this Jorth Vandeweghe fight," Colin whispered. Colmore looked offended. "But Colin, it's Anne's father. I'm practically part of the family," he replied. "You're Anne's sweetheart, and by God, I don't think you should be going with us," Colin whispered back. "We're going straight after Jorth, and there's going to be one hell of a fight." Anne looked up at Colmore with a sense of urgency in her eyes, but she remained silent. Her silence was noble, and she wanted to guide Colmore in the right direction. Colmore, on the other hand, was struggling with his own internal conflict. He knew that the code of men bound him, and he couldn't break free from it, even though he knew deep down that it was wrong. "Colin, your dad helped me get started in the cattle business," Colmore said earnestly, "and now I'm doing well. When I asked him for Anne's hand in marriage, he was happy to have me in the family. But when this talk of a fight came up, I asked your dad if I could fight on his side. He refused at first, but eventually he agreed. I think he needs me now, and I can't back out, not even for Anne." "I would if I were you," Colin replied, even though he knew he was lying. "Colin, I'm gambling that I'll come out of this fight unscathed," Colmore said with a smile. He didn't have the same fears and presentiments that Colin had. "Of course you stand a chance just like anyone else," Colin replied. "It wasn't that I was worried about so much." "What was it then?" Anne asked calmly. "If Andrew does come through alive, he'll have blood on his hands," Colin said with passion. "He can't come through without it. I've begun to feel what it means to have killed my fellow men, and I'd rather your husband and the father of your children never felt that." Colmore did not understand Colin's subtlety like Anne did. She flinched a little, her dark eyes widening. But Colmore didn't show any spiritual reaction. He was young, with wild blood, and loyal to the Vandeweghes. "Colin, never worry about my conscience," he said sharply. "Nothing would make me happier than to get a shot at every damn one of the Jorths." That established Colmore's position in the Jorth-Vandeweghe feud. Colin had nothing more to say. He respected Anne's friend and felt deep sorrow for her. Sito Vandewehe called for food and drink to be brought to the table for his guests. When his wishes were fulfilled, the women took the children into the adjoining cabin and shut the door. "Well, we can eat and talk now," Sito said with a chuckle. The newcomers wanted to hear details of what had happened. Bladel had told all he knew and had seen, but that wasn't enough. They bombarded Sito Vandewehe with questions. He laboriously and ponderously recounted his experiences of the fight at the ranch according to his impressions. Mike Vandewehe was urged to speak, but he had been sullen and taciturn lately. Despite Colin's vigilance, Mike had continued to drink whiskey. Then Colin was called upon to tell all he had seen and done. It had been Colin's intention to keep his mouth shut, first for his own sake, and secondly because he didn't like talking about his deeds. As the somber-faced men looked at him, Colin knew that he had to describe the cruelty and baseness of their enemies and vividly present his participation in the first feud fight to strengthen their loyalty to the Vandewehe cause. He talked for an hour, starting with his meeting with Jordan up on the rim and ending with an account of his killing Greaves. His listeners sat through his long narrative with unwavering interest, and at the end they were leaning forward, breathless and tense. "Ah, so Greaves got what he deserved," exclaimed Gordon. All the men around the table made comments, and the last from Blue struck Colin forcibly. "That was a strange and hell of a way to kill Greaves. Why did you do that, Colin?" "I told you. I wanted to avoid noise, and I hoped to get more of them." Blue nodded his lean, eagle-like head and sat thoughtfully, as if not convinced of anything except Colin's prowess. After a moment, Blue spoke again. "Then, going back to Colin's telling about tracking rustled cattle, I have this to say. I've long suspected that somebody living right here in the valley has been driving off cattle and dealing with rustlers, and now I'm sure of it." This speech did not amaze Sito Vandewehe as Colin expected it would. "You mean Greaves or some of his friends?" "No, they weren't in the cattle business like we are. Sure, we all knew Greaves was crooked, but what I'm figuring is that some so-called honest man in our settlement has been making crooked deals." Blue was a man of deeds rather than words, and so his strong speech made a profound impression on most of the Vandewehe faction. But to Colin's surprise, his father did not rave. Blaisdell was the one who brought the anger and insults to the conversation. Mike Vandewehe seemed unfazed by this new development in the cattle-dealing situation. Suddenly, Colin had a fleeting thought that he might have intercepted someone else's thought. He wondered if his brother Mike knew anything about the underhanded dealings that Blue was referring to. Colin pushed the idea aside and listened intently. "And if it's true, it sure makes a difference. We can't blame all the cattle rustling on Yorth," concluded Blue. "Well, it's not true," declared Sito Vandewehe gruffly. "Yorth and his hash-knife gang have been behind all the rustling in the valley for years, and they need to be eliminated." "Vandewehe, we'd all feel better if we spoke honestly," replied Blue calmly. "I'm here to support the Vandewehes, and you know what that means. But I'm not here to fight Yorth just because he might be a rustler."